Hello again, YouTube. This is Monday, Wednesday, Friday classes. Today is a Monday, so if you know the drill, you know that today is a history lecture. So today I decided to tackle a pretty difficult topic, but I feel like needs to be given its due diligence in something that by someone who's not really bound by a lot of political correctness. So, I wanted to talk about the American slave trade. Now, a bit of a disclaimer, I kind of knocked on political correctness a little bit, but I'm not saying that slavery was a good thing. There are some things that I'm going to talk about in this video that look at purely the economic side rather than the humanitarian side of slavery, but I don't want you as the audience to see this as me advocating for slavery or anything of the sort. Mostly, I'm going to try to stay within the bounds of the United States, but I'll talk about the West Indies, and in particularly, I'll also talk about Brazil because Brazil had a large slave population as well. So the American slavery started with the transatlantic passage, slave trade, which was started by the Portuguese in the early 16th century during the height of Portuguese naval power. They and, these slave traders viewed those who were captured as purely cargo and to be transported as efficiently and as cheaply as possible. I'm sure many of you have heard the horror stories about cargo dumps in the transatlantic passage, which is something that actually happened. And because of the economic side, but they would be taken to Brazil, the West Indies, even some parts of the southern continental America, as far north as North Carolina, to work in tobacco, sugar, and I believe coca as well. The English slave trade incorporated at first Indians from East India, Indo-Pak region, mostly from a area around Calcutta, and that's why the reason why even today you'd see in places like Trinidad a large Urdu speaking population or Bengali or Urdu speaking population because of this English importation of Indian slaves. The English, though, found that the Indians weren't actually very well acclimated to the work, so they decided to um, choose to work with African slaves instead. The American slave trade actually does go further back before the introduction of Portuguese imported African slaves. The um, Native Americans were initially enslaved by the Spanish, and a Franciscan, I believe at least he was a Franciscan, named Bartolomeo de las Casas, was um, petitioned to the Pope to pass a bull to end the enslavement of Native Americans, and the Pope did issue this bull to end the enslavement of Native Americans, but the Spanish saw that when one market closes, another market opens, sort of nature abhors a vacuum thing, and they decided to start importing slaves from Africa via the Portuguese. So, like I said, I mostly want to focus on the United States, and the first importation of African slaves into the United States was actually a very small shipment of African women into the new colony in Virginia around Jamestown to actually provide services of nursing, wet nurses, and it eventually grew as the tobacco trade in what's now the southeastern United States grew. So, what were the impacts economically of this? The impact on West Africa is historians actually still debate whether this had a negative impact on the West African economy or not. The debate is that primarily the enslaved Africans were being sold by fellow Africans, so it's that they would be enslaved anyway. But the argument saying that it negatively impacted the West African environment, the West African economy, is that it was a loss of manpower. It wasn't a brain drain because they wouldn't have been valued that way anyway. It was a loss of manpower because West Africa is rich in minerals and they would be enslaved to by other Africans to mine minerals instead. So it wasn't necessarily the brain drain factor that we talk about in geography. It was more of a loss of manpower. And the other argument isn't necessarily that it didn't negatively impact the West African economy, it's that it simply had a neutral impact on the West African economy. What can be certain, though, is that the impact of the profits that particularly the British Empire saw during slavery before its abolition of the slave trade boosted its economy to the point where it kick-started the economic abilities of the Industrial Revolution. I would then say that they just, like the Spanish moved from one form of slavery to another, the British pretty much moved from one form of slavery to another. They weren't enslaving Africans anymore. They just decided to practice things like indentured servitude and workhouses and poorhouses and things like that, where they just enslaved poor people and orphans. So that is nearly a general consensus of the economic impact that it had on the British Empire. Now, the continuation of slavery in the United States is that let's sort of fast forward to the actual formation of the United States. So, prior to the Revolutionary War, slavery was legal in almost all 13 colonies. I believe that there were some exceptions like Rhode Island or places like that weren't really even firm, or places even on settlement, the lesser settled colonies and places like maybe Rhode Island had an abolition in place at that point. I didn't research the exact state laws of, or provincial laws of each of the 13 colonies, but places that you would traditionally see as abolition states: Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, strong abolitionist powerhouses had legal slavery at the time. Phyllis Wheatley, the famous African American poet, was enslaved in a Massachusetts Boston household. So there was a difference in the way that slaves were treated in continued slavery north and in the south. In the south, they were pretty much used what they were used for right up into the Civil War, and that is as an agrarian workforce. And in the North, they were used mostly as factory jobs or as household help. The factory working jobs were um, started to be replaced more by immigration, similar to how it would be in England, was starts to be replaced more by immigration and free African labor, not free as in slaves or free labor, but free as in our people that have the freedom to move about and seek employment as they will, are not bound to a particular employer, um, uh, to be a slave to a particular employer. So these factory jobs are replaced by immigration as abolition begins to spread through the North. Um, Abolitionism does take a big sweeping uh, abolitionism takes a big sweeping upward, what's the word I'm looking for, uh, takes gets a really big kickoff during the Second Great Awakening. And it did have advocates, but this is where abolitionism becomes a big issue, is during the Second Great Awakening. And the Second Great Awakening, if you're not already familiar with the term, was a revival among American Christians to sort of sweep up the nation into a religious revival, and it primarily took place in northern states. The Burnover District, which is famously where Joseph Smith comes from, is in upper state New York, and that was pretty much one of the biggest hotbeds of religious activity during the Second Great Awakening was in upstate New York. There's the traditional Quaker influence in Pennsylvania, which then ends up evolving into the more radical Quakers end up evolving into Shaker communes. It, uh, so the religious revival ends up breeding abolitionism in the North and quickly stamps out, as well, along with several lawsuits by people who end up being named freemen. The what are called the freeman suits, because the people that in the North, whenever a slave would sue for their freedom and would usually win in these northern states such as Massachusetts, they would no longer hold their master's last name, they would hold the last name Freeman. So that's why it's called the Freeman suits. So there's but slavery continues to thrive in the South. Why does slavery continue to thrive in the South? Why? Because the environment is actually very right for it. The ecological environment, the social environment, etc. They, the southern states didn't actually come under the same sort of the same type of religious revival during the Second Great Awakening. The South did come under a sort of religious revival, but not the same principles that were being taught in the North. They started to have a restorationist revival rather than an awakening revival where the existing denominations were reviving people. They had a restorationist revival, and the restorationists said that, all the other denominations that we've been going with thus far aren't really that good. So this is where the Church of Christ movement comes out of, or the Seventh-day Adventists these are restorationist movements saying that, or the apostolic church or things like that, we need to get back to the the primitive church. And one of the things that these Christian primitivists or these Christian restorationists would do is they would go back to the letters of Paul to Philemon and in Colossians, etc., and they would find these passages that Paul had written about slavery and being like, hey, Paul was pro-slavery, and they would sort of make their interpretation about that, and that so there was a lot of religious back and forth on the slavery advocate abolition issue as well. So what ends up becoming the big contention between, in the North and the South, you have a stalemate, but there's this political doctrine that takes hold in the United States called manifest destiny, or America's right to continue to expand westward. And expansionism becomes the battleground. For a while, the the policy was that that they would balance each other out. If there was a free state, there would be a slave state. As soon as they had to come in pairs. A free state had to balance out a slave state, and vice versa as states entered the Union. And the problems came whenever it wasn't such a regular thing, where territories became more few and far between. Territories weren't very acclimated to agricultural inclination. Therefore, slavery wasn't a very viable option for them, and this would irritate slave states. Or if a new territory wanted to determine itself to become a slave state, this would irritate free states, etc. So this is a lot of the political back and forth going on about slavery among slaves themselves. As we've established by this time, slavery is pretty sectional. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery remain actually a party issue. It is determined somewhat sectionally, but it remains a party issue. For instance, I mentioned Joseph Smith earlier. Brigham Young, who was appointed the governor of Utah, is actually from Vermont, a free state. The only time that he's probably ever set foot in a slave state was whenever the Latter-day Saint community was trying to establish a foothold in western Missouri, and that went over like a ton of bricks. And so that's probably the only exposure that Brigham Young has ever had to slavery, while in an interview, Brigham Young did say that the only reason that he didn't own slaves is because he didn't live in an environment where it was economically beneficial to own slaves. He had no moral issue with owning slaves. He had an economic issue with owning slaves. And going back to, you have to be in the right environment for slavery economically to work, and it actually only ends up working for the top cream of society. One of the things that historians notice, that whenever slavery is used in a society, it's actually used in the poorer sections of society. This is another correlation that we can make between the United States and Brazil, is that sections of Brazil that practiced slavery are historically the poorer sections of Brazil. The reason this is because with the free labor market, or the slave labor market, it creates a system to where richer people do not have to hire people who are free to work for them, and sort of it's not in a Reaganomic sense a trickle down economy. It's the money just flows to the top and just stays there. So everyone else who's not part of this aristocratic class is sort of living in a colony. Another thing about this situation as well, it wasn't much better in the North. Um, like I said about England, they just sort of switched one form of slavery to another. Immigrant labor was just as bad off, if not worse off, than slave labor. And again, it was a similar situation. The money just kind of flows to the top and stays there. And um, the even if politically these free and slave states act as if they're opposing each other, it's more or less like politics nowadays. A lot of it was a game. The North would actually pass laws that, to be realistically implemented, would require the continued existence of slavery. For instance, the tariffs of the 1830s, which was a famous debacle where the state of South Carolina actually threatened to secede from the Union during the Jackson administration because of the tariff of 1832, I want to say it was. And so to realistically implement these would actually require the continuation of slavery. Either that or it was a sort of blackmail against the slave market that they couldn't make the only way that slavery could be made profitable would be to continue interstate trade rather than international trade. There's a lot of funny finickiness that goes into the economics and politics of slavery. Now, the slaves themselves were a very tight community. They had a very unique form. They developed a very unique form of spirituality. They also developed a very unique form of passive resistance. Their unique form of spirituality was highly based around the Exodus story found in the Bible of Moses leading the Hebrews out of Egypt who were being treated in some sort of slavery, second class citizen status, depending on which biblical historian you talk to, whether they're a conscripted workforce or all out slaves. The or being led out of bondage, out of the house of bondage. And so they would create songs around this, seeing salvation really in a Judaic way of being led out of Babylon or being led out of Egypt, being brought out of Egypt. And their interesting form of passive resistance is they wouldn't straight up run away or start revolts. There were a few cases of runaways and revolts and things like that. Runaways started to happen more and more frequently as time went on, but they had smaller ways of passive resistance, such as intentionally accidentally breaking tools and things like that, or it never really entered into insubordination or things like that, but there definitely were cases of passive resistance among the slave population. So that's a lot of the economics and politics and even some of the internal slave culture. The thing that ended up bringing a lot of this into the national conversation instead of just sectional tension were two things. One was a political event and one was a social event. The first, I'm going to talk about the first as being the political event was the Dred Scott case. The Dred Scott case was a Supreme Court decision that said that all blacks in the United States did not have the right to sue in court, to press charges, or to sue in court. This actually has very large overreaching implications that I'll mention later. And the second, a social event, is similar to the Great Awakening. It reamps the abolitionist movement, is the production of a play called Uncle Tom's Cabin, which the slavery advocate counterproduction was Aunt Phyllis's Cabin. So it's sort of just like the anti Uncle Tom's Cabin. So the Uncle Tom's Cabin was supposed to be an expose of the abuse that happens to slaves within the slave system. So, fact of the matter is, abuse has happened, and frankly, quite a bit during the on plantations to slaves, because slaves were viewed as property, and the sort of counter argument to that, everything that happened on slave plantations was just one big perpetual act of abuse, that, work all day and get beat all night sort of thing, is that even if slaves are just viewed as property, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to make a very large cash investment, sometimes into hundreds, even thousands of dollars of investments, which hundreds of dollars of investment during this time period, it's like buying a tractor. You're basically buying a tractor with each new farmhand you get. So it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to make that kind of investment and then beat it to the point that it can't work. It's like if I just buy a $45,000 tractor and go out and shoot it a bunch of holes in it with a shotgun. But there are people who do that. There are people who get $45,000 tractors and just leave them on the lawn to rust. I'm not saying that abuse didn't happen and didn't happen quite regularly. I'm just saying the abuse being a standard practice doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The other thing on the where's my train of thought? The abuse happening is that even in the Reconstruction period in the South, there were testimonies of former slaves who, when they discovered that it was their former master, who were members of the Ku Klux Klan, they weren't afraid of the Ku Klux Klan anymore. That showed that that is a sort of testimony that their master wasn't a really scary guy. Even though he looks scary now, it's just the master. He's not a scary guy. And I just find that to be, interesting testimony. I believe that the woman who gave that testimony, her name was Harriet Solomon, said that whenever she discovered that her master was one of the people riding with the Ku Klux Klan, she wasn't scared of him no more. And that's a very interesting testimony. So this, a lot of this ends up culminating into political elections. The overreaching implication that I was talking about of the Dred Scott case is why we end up with cases of people like the man in 12 Years a Slave, is because people didn't have to fear repercussions of blacks pressing charges against them anymore. It became actually pretty easy to kidnap and sell free blacks into slavery, northern free blacks into slavery. And so, because of the Dred Scott case and because of the fugitive slave laws, a lot of this became real political issues within elections, and this was something. These were several platforms, as well as ending slavery, moving into new territories. There were many different things that were tried, such as self determination, which resulted in Bleeding Kansas, if you feel like looking that up. And this all just ended up culminating into all these sectional issues and slavery issues actually ended up culminating into the election of 1860. And there were several other. Um, this then goes to, was the Civil War about slavery, or was it about something more? A lot of it was about slavery, but I do also believe that the Civil War was about something more. Currently, my video is about slavery, so I'm just going to cover the slavery issues. But we could get into, maybe I'll get into at a later date, how the Civil War was about um, simply Southern states being overpowered in Congress on many other issues, such as the Tariff of 1832, the North basically using the South as an agrarian colony, and other things like that. And but so this all ends up culminating into the election of 1860. Southern states end up seceding. So slavery does not end at Fort Sumter. It continues for about another 2 or 3 years after the election of 1860 and Fort Sumter. So what happens with slaves is they end up becoming contraband of war. So that means that whenever the Union Army enters into Confederate territory and they find slaves, they will confiscate them as contraband of war. This does not mean that they are free, it means that they are confiscated from their owners. So a lot of these slaves, and there's actually a very interesting experiment that was done um, among these contraband of war on an island just off the coast of South Carolina called Port Royal. That basically you could see this being a microcosm uh, of the Reconstruction occurring. A lot of the social problems, a lot of the social incentives, etc., that happened during Reconstruction happened right there on that island in Port Royal. And that's not even taking into consideration the ex Confederate whites. This is just the problems that would happen with newly freed slaves that you can look into the mission. I believe it was a Presbyterian mission that was doing all this on the island of Port Royal. So, as contraband of war, a lot of times these Africans would be recruited into the Union Army. They would be usually put to menial tasks of camp upkeep and things such as that, because they just weren't viewed as being as capable of fighting as a white soldier was. So that again shows that racist policies weren't just confined to slave states, that the Jim Crow policies were very rampant in Illinois, New York, Michigan, places like that. That these were racist policies. Again, I'm just trying to cover just a general survey of slavery, and that's about all I can say about it. There's other things that you can look up, such as slave codes and things like that. I just hope that I gave you a general overview of the economics and the social side of the American slave trade. I hope that I handled everything fairly in a way that that accurately represents the time period and is not offensive to anyone's social views of anything. Like I said, I'm not trying to advocate slavery. Slavery is a bad thing. It's not good to implement it in any sort of way at all, whether it be purely bound slavery or even some sort of quasi slavery that, such as underpaid labor, child labor, things like that. I'm totally against all of that personally. But as a historian, I believe that it's best to meet the past on its own terms. And that's the best I could do for giving my understanding of the American slave trade. I will see you Wednesday if God wills it, and I'm out. Peace.